now. So we are recording this conversation because these guys are going to present some really interesting data that would be useful for us to go back and listen to at times. So we are recording it. However, if we have a conversation at the end where it's just dialogue and we want to turn off the recording, we can do that. So just putting that out there for everyone. Thanks for being here on a Friday in November. And yeah, thanks from the WildX XChange group. Doug, Natalie, myself, Kibbs, who can't be here today, John, who can't be here today, and our awesome boss, Gary. So thank you. Jackson and Yanna, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jane. And I would just echo the thanks to everyone that Jane gave. I think conversations like these are particularly useful and important, and are on behalf of our group, and we're going to introduce ourselves in a moment. We were summer research team doing some work on these issues. We really appreciate the opportunity to be part of WildX and these important conversations. Before we start too, I want to just take a moment to particularly recognize the courage of survivors in participating in these type of conversations. I know that it's tremendously difficult to participate in these conversations if you are a survivor, but at the same time, your perspectives and ideas that you bring to the table and the awareness that you help bring to others is really important. So we appreciate that. I wanted to start off just briefly with who we are and why we're here. So I'm going to start and ask, I think we've got Professor Weisberg and Maddie Reimer here from our research team. I'm going to ask them to do like 20 or 30-second intros. I'll just say that our summer research team broadly convened to investigate the effectiveness, particularly of peer-led bystander intervention training techniques in promoting sexual assault prevention. So that's the broad topic we were looking at. I've been involved with these issues a little bit more broadly in work that I do with a group called Interact that has done sexual assault prevention trainings on college campuses and military bases in the United States and throughout the world. And I've been doing that work for about the past 5 years. I haven't counted up recently, but I've done somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 to 100 one-hour trainings as a facilitator, and had the opportunity to, impact some pretty significant communities, particularly in the military. We've done some work on naval and marine bases, and some of these issues are pretty contentious in some of those environments, as they can be on college campuses as well. With that, I'm going to kick it over to Professor Weisberg to do a brief self-introduction as well.
Sure. I'm Yanna Weisberg. I'm over in the psychology department. And unlike Jackson, I don't have a large history of experience with doing this type of work. What I do have is I have experience in teaching a bit on sexual assault and sexual violence, especially as it pertains to violence against women. And Maddie was one of my students in psychology of women and gender, and she came forward with her interest in these prevention trainings. And that's where I was like, wow, this is really important. And I wonder if they've considered all these other aspects that I know of as a psychologist, like how do you change people's attitudes? How do you change norms? How do you, get the right message for your audience? And so I was really curious about that, and that's why I joined the project.
Thank you, Yanna. Maddie, I'm going to kick it over to you for a moment to do a brief self-introduction as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm Maddie Reimer. I'm a senior psychology major, and I'm also involved in leadership and athletics. So it's kind of cool to see like my two worlds kind of colliding. I've also done a lot of training with bystander engagement in FSL as well. So I have kind of a background in this, and then also just my kind of interdisciplinary interest in psychology in Dr. Weisberg's class. And yeah, this summer we got to kind of explore more of that peer-to-peer education kind of model and stuff. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Great, thank you, Maddie. And I just want to acknowledge briefly, she couldn't be here today, or she might be able to join us late, but Angie McElvey was, who's a senior in communication arts, was our other summer student researcher who was part of our project team on the work that we did collaboratively this past summer. So I wanted to start off by saying this in terms of how we're going to proceed today, because Jane mentioned we're going to share some information with you, and we certainly are, but we strategically want to share about 10 to 15 minutes of information and then really see where the conversation in our group takes us. So we really want to open it up to more dialogue to this group on some of these issues. I want to say in general that we're really appreciative to be part of the WildX series. And I don't think any of you probably are, but in case any of you are wondering about the race and social justice connection here, we very much view this issue through the lens of gender oppression. And we think really what we're combating here are issues mainly of oppression of women. And if you think about other race and social justice issues, that theme of oppression and how power of one group over another group creates inequalities that we then have to come back and address. So within that broader framework of oppression is the way we're approaching this work. And I just wanted to offer that to you all as a broader kind of framing mechanism for the work that we're doing. I also just wanted to briefly share a little bit of Linfield information, mindful again, as I said at the beginning, that there may be some survivors in our audience today. I want to let you know there are always resources and reporting options available to you, some of which are confidential. Jane is a Title IX deputy, so Jane, please jump in and correct me if I'm wrong about any of this. But I believe the confidential resources on Linfield's campus are the counseling and student health centers, as well as the chaplain's office in Melrose. And off-campus confidential help is also available at the Willamette Valley Medical Center, where they do have sexual assault nurse examiners always on call. So those are some confidential reporting options. I did want to let you know that all other departments on campus are mandatory reporters. And what that means is that when you report an incident to them, they will take action. And that includes faculty, residence life, campus safety, and the McMinnville Police Department off campus. So here's what I would say to everyone, and I mentioned this just as a framing in these types of discussions, because often disclosures and other things will happen when you're talking about these issues. If you're not sure whether or not a department or individual on campus is a mandatory reporter, I just encourage you to always ask before talking to them. I'm going to also recognize, I already have with Jane, but we've got a lot of other expertise in this room in terms of individuals who've been involved with developing Title IX policies, but we do have several Title IX deputies on campus, including Jane Samuels. So thanks to all those Title IX deputies for the work that you do. So two other things I'm going to talk about before we open it up, and Yanna and Maddie, feel free to jump in and anything I'm saying if you want to add, but don't feel like that you have to. I think we can kind of let the conversation flow naturally. I wanted to go over some brief definitions of key terms, because I think in talking about these issues, sometimes there's confusion over terminology. And I also wanted to just share some sexual assault statistics, just give you all a quick rundown of some of the figures, both about lifetime incidents of sexual assault, but also some statistics that are more specific to sexual assaults on college and university campuses. But I first want to begin with this, just definitions of the term rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and most importantly, the term consent. And we'll spend a little bit more time with that. So these terms, the first three, rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment, they're used interchangeably sometimes. They can sometimes create confusion. So I just want to go over them. But one thing in general, I want you to know, they're in an order of specific to general. So sexual harassment includes sexual assault and rape, and sexual assault's a broader category that also includes rape. So that's an important thing to know, because often in media reports and in other venues, these words are used interchangeably. When we're talking about that first term, rape, we're talking about a specific criminal act defined as unwanted sexual intercourse or sexual acts. And the legal definition, particularly the FBI definition, but also a lot of state laws, sometimes include specific language about penetration of the vagina or anus with any body part or object. They get that specific when defining rape. With cases of rape, sometimes threats of force or drugs and alcohol are involved. And it also often includes ignoring or removing a person's ability to make an autonomous decision about what happens to their body. So those are kind of some key definitional elements when we're talking about rape. Sexual assault, as I mentioned before, includes rape, but it's a broader term because it also describes a range of other criminal acts that are sexual in nature. These could include things like unwanted touching and kissing, or rubbing, groping, or forcing the victim to touch the perpetrator in sexual ways. So it's just a broader category, and it's important to keep that in mind because those two terms in particular during in the Me Too movement were used interchangeably a lot. And I'm not saying that created a lot of confusion, but I think in the minds of some, it might have. So I wanted to make that clarification. Sexual harassment then includes rape and sexual assault, but it also incorporates other behaviors such as sexual coercion, or what's sometimes called quid pro quo. That's the incident where a boss would say to an employee something like "sleep with me or you're fired." That's considered sexual harassment. Unwanted or unwelcome sexual attention, things like touching, hugging, or stroking, and other forms of gender harassment. So under this category, we're talking about things like sexist and degrading comments and words, crude terms and images, and the like. So you can see how sexual harassment's a little more all-encompassing to take into account other behaviors that go beyond what we typically describe when we're talking about sexual assault. Here's the most important thing, though, of all the terms I'm going to define, and that's consent. And I'm going to go to the Linfield College Student Handbook for this, and Jane and Yanna and others who've got expertise, please chime in if there are things that I'm missing, but I'm going to try to be very detailed about this. According to our handbook, you have to have what's called explicit consent. And what explicit consent is it's an informed, affirmative, conscious, voluntary, and mutual agreement to engage in sexual activity. So that means that it's the responsibility of each person involved in sexual activity to ensure that she or he has the explicit consent of the other participant. Just to make sure we're all clear on this, lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent. Silence does not mean consent. And explicit consent can be withdrawn or revoked at any time. So you might be engaging in some sort of act like kissing that doesn't give you consent to do something else. And that's important to know. Explicit consent also cannot be given by a person who's incapacitated by drugs or alcohol, has a medical or mental disability, or is a minor, someone who's under 18 years old. Finally, persons cannot consent if they're being threatened physically or threatened in another manner, such as being deported, getting a failing grade, losing a scholarship. So in order for sexual activity to be consensual, you need to receive explicit consent. And importantly, the other person must have been able to give explicit consent. I want to pause for a minute to, because I know there's a lot of other expertise in the room around these issues. Anything any of you would add to that definition of consent, and particularly how it applies to Linfield and our student policies?
Jackson, this is Jeff McKay, Dean of Student. I think you did a great job. The one thing in working with our consultant over this summer that we did in the student policy guide is have a list of definitions throughout at the beginning of that.
Oh, good. Okay.
That's been very helpful in doing that. So there is a definition section on alcohol and substance induced incapacitation. There's a definition around consent, explicit consent. So one of the recommendations from our consultant was to have a series of definitions that help explain some of the more technical things that you need to have when you get into policy. So I'd encourage folks to look at the current student policy guide, which does have a list of those definitions. We found that was a good exercise for that committee to go through.
That's great. And thank you, Jeff. And I'm sorry, I just noticed you joined the chat, so I didn't acknowledge you at the beginning, but I'm so glad to have our Dean of Students here, who's another one of our Title IX officers. So
I was in a meeting and came in late. I apologize.
Yeah, no, glad to have you here. Thank you for joining us. All right, well, the final thing I want to say before we open it up, because I've talked a little longer than maybe I wanted to, and that's okay, and we'll see how the conversation flows after this, but I did want to go into some sexual assault statistics, and I'm going to give you two categories of statistics, and these are kind of a compilation of or an aggregation of kind of the best available academic research that's been done to kind of pull together these numbers. So you've probably read studies that have slightly different numbers than this. We're looking at, on the aggregate, what are some of the stats that we feel pretty confident about. So in terms of lifetime statistics first, and then we'll get into college and university statistics. We know that lifetime across a range of studies, 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted in her lifetime. The number for men over lifetime is 1 in 10. We know that 1 in 8 lesbian women will be assaulted, 40% of gay men, 50% of bisexual women and men, 1 in 4 transgender individuals, and 40% of women with physical disabilities. So those are some of the best lifetime numbers we know across different groups. Now, on colleges and university campuses, there are a range of statistics, and the one I want to start with is that, and this is reported rapes on campuses. On average, there are about 35 rapes, and remember those definitions of rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment vary, per 1,000 female students per academic year. At Linfield, across both McMinnville campus and Portland campus, we have over 1,000 female students. Our numbers, at least according to Cleary stats, are a lot lower than 35. And we can, when we open the discussion, we can talk about that. I mean, I think one way to read that certainly is that we're providing a really safe environment. Another way to read that is that there's some underreporting going on. So I think that's something as a community we have been discussing a little bit, and there's certainly other things we could discuss related to that. But 35 per 1,000 across the research per academic year is about what the stats would suggest we should be seeing. About 20 to 25% of college women will experience a rape or attempted rape during their time in college. 25% of college men are involved in sexual aggression. And men in fraternities or athletics are at a higher risk for committing assaults. And I'm going to come back to that because I want to frame that a little bit more, particularly for this group. But the final stat I want to give you is that 9 out of 10 college rape survivors knew the assailant. So these aren't, on college campuses in particular, there's not a lot of stranger rape going on. The kind of, typical story about the stranger who jumps out of the bushes and attacks somebody, that's not what we're talking about. This is more someone the survivor knew. Who's committing these assaults? Overall, 99% of rapes are committed by men against women, children, and other men. So I want to be very clear, when I said 1 in 10 men have been assaulted lifetime, the vast majority of those are men committing assaults against other men. And as I emphasized before, and this is true not only on campuses, but lifetime, most of the time when these incidents occur, it's someone that the survivor knows. So that idea of a stranger assaulting someone, while it does happen, it's more the exception rather than the rule in terms of how these incidents play out. I wanted to go back to men in fraternities and sports, because I think particularly for this group, you might have some questions about this. And I want to be clear about something. The research has shown that men in fraternities or in sports are at higher risk of assaulting women. But let me be clear about this. This does not mean that men in fraternities and on athletic teams are committing a lot of sexual assaults. I think what it simply means is that sexual predators that are already on our campuses believe that they can hide in groups where hypermasculine values are encouraged. So, if I'm in an environment, whether it's a fraternity or on a team, where I can joke about women or say you play like a girl or you're weak, or, those sorts of things, those comments provide an environment where sexually aggressive college men will seek that environment out because they have male friends, or they feel that they have male friends or a community where there's support for sexually exploitive behavior. Now, it may not be the case, right? But it's just the idea that the language and the culture and other things, other contributors to that overall gender oppression that I started with can feed in and make incidents more likely to happen. So with that, I'm going to pause and first give Yanna and Maddie an opportunity to jump in if they want to add anything to kind of some of our framing materials, and then open it up to all of you for some good conversation about this.
I'll start, and then I'd love to let Maddie speak a bit about what her interests have been with our research. As a personality psychologist, I study broadly individual differences. And so for me, it was of a huge interest when I was teaching all this to see what are risk factors for perpetration, like Jackson just discussed, and risk factors for victimization. And one of the biggest risk factors that has been seen on college campuses is previous experience. And so a risk factor for perpetration is previous perpetration, and a risk factor for victimization is previous victimization. So there's actually some fascinating studies done where they had participants listen to I think it was a discussion or a conflict, and the conflict escalated and escalated, and they just asked participants to like press the button when they think, this is dangerous, or, stuff is not good here. And what they found is that people who had been victimized previously waited longer. And so they didn't notice that the risk factors were there as early as did people who were not victimized previously. And so psychology has been focusing on what happens, how do our perceptions change of what is okay behavior versus what is not okay behavior, and what is expected behavior, and what is like normative behavior. And that may help understand some of the like hypermasculinity connections as well as risk factors for perpetration. Because hypermasculinity, like if you're not familiar with that term, like it's like extreme stereotypical masculine behaviors, thoughts, etc. And so there's usually a lot of importance placed on physical prowess, on aggression and strength and sexuality. And so people who ascribe to that kind of mentality, alongside of it with sexuality and strength, sometimes comes power, and exerting your power and exploiting your power by oppressing other people. And so my interest came from, okay, are we channeling our prevention tactics towards these people who are higher risk for perpetration and victimization? Or are we channeling them at the vast majority of people who are not perpetrators, who are trying to be bystanders? And why don't we do all of it? Like, why don't we try to aim all the different types of prevention techniques that we can in order to prevent sexual assault, sexual aggression, sexual violence before it even gets to the bystander point? And so that's where I'd love to focus more work in the future as well. Maddie?
Yeah, so going off of that, a huge area of interest for me was kind of, as Jackson and Yanna were both saying, kind of the culture aspect. And I think this especially pertains to this group of people in athletics, especially because we talk about culture all the time on teams. And the, not a problem, but a byproduct of focusing so much of our prevention on peer-to-peer engagement and bystander engagement is that it's dependent on someone else being there to see it. And so we need to make sure that we're taking preventative steps before that happens. And that means shaping the culture in these kind of high-risk cultures and that are stereotypically in sports and in fraternities and, well, just Greek life in general, but that we're kind of changing that culture from leadership down, that we're not allowing those kinds of like implicit or explicit types of comments or remarks or just cultural norms to exist. And that's where that large cultural change will happen, so that instead of waiting for someone to engage in the situation that may or may not be there, that it's just changing the mindset of the people that are engaging in that risky behavior. So yeah.
So as I said, I think we're at a point where I'd like to open it up to conversation. I know we've shared a lot of information with you in this first half hour or so. my hope is that we can have some community conversation about this. And I acknowledge that this is a difficult subject to talk about. If we have some challenges in getting conversation off the ground, I have some ideas about how we can comment and have some conversation more anonymously. But I think let's open it up to questions first and see where things go. And we might jump into that more anonymous sharing and questioning option if we feel like that's where the conversation is taking us.
Jackson, I had a question. With the statistics, along with those statistics, is there statistics that involve alcohol in these situations?
Yeah, that's a good question, Doug. And yes, there are. I don't of those stats overall. I don't know the breakdown with each of them, but alcohol definitely has been like pulled out as a factor in some of the research. And Yanna, Maddie, I don't know if either of you off the top of your head, I don't have it right in front of me. I know we looked at some of that this summer, but I don't want to give you a number right now, Doug, without looking it up and making sure I've got the accurate figure.
Yeah, well, maybe we take a little time to look up that exact number. I don't have numbers, but I do have some research findings. Alcohol use and intoxication is definitely one of the risk factors for perpetration and a risk factor for victimization. And so in psych literature, they've done studies where they randomly assign people to be intoxicated or not, and then have them respond to these scenarios. And in one study, they randomly assign college men to consume alcoholic or non-alcoholic beverages. They get very creative with the near beer and things like that. And then they gave them a sexual violence scenario and asked how they would think, feel, and behave in that scenario. And compared to the men who were completely sober, intoxicated men had higher scores on measures that the woman's sexual arousal and their own sexual arousal, anger, and belief that the woman owed them sex was higher. Perceptions that the man in the scenario who acted violently was acting appropriately, and they were more willing to act like the man in the situation compared to the sober men. And so alcohol does seem to change our perceptions of what we're doing, of what is good rationale for what we're doing, and of the appropriateness of our behavior.
I also want to jump in on that and just say that, because I always say this to groups when we're doing trainings, because alcohol comes up and, you know, that's a big issue on naval bases and other places where I've done trainings. I always share with folks that being under the influence of alcohol does not excuse criminal behavior. And I do think that sexual assault in particular is one of those cases where we're more often to excuse behavior because of drinking, even though we know statistically just 80% of people who are in jail and prison today were under the influence of alcohol or drugs when they committed their crimes. And I just find it interesting and bring it up as an analogy. We would never say if someone robbed a bank and they were drunk, well, they were drinking. So we can't fault them for not robbing the bank. You just can't control yourself when you're drunk. So I do worry about that. And to echo Yanna's research, one other thing I would comment on is that some men drink heavily, not to loosen inhibitions. I think, you know, particularly when it comes to a crime like sexual assault, you know, oh, you're drinking, you're at a party, having a good time. You know, make it easier to talk with women and that sort of thing. Some men drink heavily in those situations because they want to use it as an excuse that they were not in control of their actions, or they want to disassociate from predatory behaviors. You know, sexual assault is a crime about power. You know, we often think it's about sexual arousal, sexual gratification, but if we look at it through the lens of oppression and power, and I think that's an important way to look at it, the issue of alcohol is still a complicated one, but I hope we can look at it the way we look at alcohol in other power crimes. Like we wouldn't excuse someone shooting someone else if they were drunk, in the same way that I think just societally we have a bias of saying, well, there was drinking going on. How can anyone be at blame for this crime that happened? There's still a crime that happened. We need to keep that in perspective.
There's an interesting question in the chat if you haven't seen it, and I'm trying to pull up the answer specifically to that. Another important caveat, well, not necessarily caveat, I might actually present this in my class that's happening in 45 minutes because it's an interactive effect. And so the effect of alcohol making men's opinions being more okay with sexually aggressive behaviors was strongest for men who previously aligned with those hypermasculine and hostile sexist viewpoints. And so it's not like give any man alcohol and his perceptions will change completely. It's especially true for the men who already had those views.
I was curious. I've been around a lot of different cultures professionally, and anytime I feel like athletics and I was in advertising as well, and there's kind of the alcohol effect with that industry, but I totally agree with what you're saying about the power dynamics. But you hear the term rape culture. I'm curious what your thoughts and what your maybe findings around that term, because I feel like that gets thrown around a lot, and especially within athletics programs, and how maybe that's something we can think deeper about as a society.
Yeah, Natalie, that's a good question. And, I would open it up to broader discussion to everyone else to talk about a little bit about how that's been used personally and professionally in different environments you've been in. The one thing I would say about it is that I think it gets misread by different groups, that term rape culture. When I hear it, and it's partly because of my lens and the professional work I do, I think more about it from the idea that I started the conversation out with, of gender oppression. And, so the idea of rape culture is just establishing a culture where it's okay to talk in degrading ways about women and to even make sexist jokes and sexist remarks. I think those things, just in the same way to talk about, and I'm trying to expand it out, not create a false equivalency, but to different types of oppressions, we would in most instances, I think most of us call out a racist joke if we heard someone saying it, right? But how often do we let a sexist joke slide? And my point is that, like, whether you call it rape culture, although I realize that's a stronger term that for some people might be too much, or gender oppression, or use another label for it, anytime we're letting those things go, we're allowing for those beliefs about power differentials and oppression to continue to operate without questioning them. So I don't know that rape culture is the term that works for everyone, because I think for some it's, some read that as a much more extreme version of what I just articulated, not just maybe sexist jokes, but other behaviors. But I think that's the level at which we have to start confronting these oppressions. We can't just say it's okay to share degrading images of women or make really disparaging remarks about women. We've got to question those just like we question other forms of oppression, and just as powerfully. But, you don't want to get into and I think this is a tricky thing with all the conversations we're having in WildX. Whenever I teach about diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, you don't want to get into what's called the oppression Olympics either, and say that, racism is, worse than sexism, or, compare other sorts of religious oppression. I just ask you a question, like the visceral reaction that you have to something like a swastika being on a whiteboard on campus, which created a major, diversity, inclusion, and equity incident on campus last year. Do we have the same sort of reaction when we see calendars with half-naked women on them in different offices on campus or something, right? I mean, I think we're not always treating these different types of oppressive behaviors or materials in a way that acknowledges the potential oppressive messages that images or words or jokes are communicating.
Yeah, I think it's I love that you laid out the definitions earlier, because I do think that's so important. I love what you're saying too about, I'm with you 100% on the oppression Olympics. I've done some research with minority women who are in the athletic director position, and it's a really small number. But those women, it was really shocking to me that, they they were definitely, they felt they were more discriminated against because of their race than their gender. And I felt they themselves were more accepting of sexism, because it's like, hey, it's sports. This is what we're working in. And like, it's like, that was really kind of shocking to me. And I think it is, when you think about, you know, we've talked a little bit about intersectionality on here and how that dynamic comes into play too. But I just wanted to share that because I thought that was another interesting thing that I saw, that I agree with you 100%. I think people are more accepting of sexism, I think, broadly in society. Yeah. Oh, we got people with questions. So Reiner.
All right, thank you. My question is around the some of the commentary that Jackson just made regarding the term rape culture, and so I'm just wondering, my own just sort of personal reaction to that, to justifying that the use of that term in situations where we have an oppressive environment is much more likely to lead to resistance or denial from people than. I think you can parallel that with just in our current political climate with the use of the term white supremacy. There are a lot of people who are in denial of white supremacy because in their mind that means you're running around with a hood and endorsing KKK mentality or philosophy. And but for those of us who acknowledge that white supremacy exists in our society, don't necessarily see it that way, right? But so I think that when you have an oppressive environment and you're using, and I understand what to communicate opposition to that oppressive environment, I think the use of, there's a risk with using that language of that's that strong, or that is implying behavior that is not necessarily equivalent to oppressive sorts of acts. That are obviously much more extreme when we talk about using the term rape. So I'm just wondering if there's thoughts on the, or is this really just, is that being then permissive or sort of, allowing, or going easy on, behavior that is that is related to or increases the likelihood of the more extreme. Is there a progressive behavior? Then if we're allowing a little bit, right, then people see it as permissive, and that rape, is fine then too, if we're allowing these other things. So thoughts on that?
My initial thought, and I'll let others jump in if you want to, is that I see the analogy that you're making to a more extreme label like white supremacy. The labels, and especially in the charged political environment that we're in, aren't as important to me as acknowledgement of the behaviors. And I think I do worry that for some, a word like rape culture makes them disavow, because they're not going to see gender oppression because they're not looking at it in that all-encompassing term. At the same time, I think you also have to acknowledge on the other side of the continuum that we get these extreme terms in our discourse in part because these behaviors are systematically ignored, and kind of going to a very extreme label for something, particularly in an environment where we're communicating a lot on social media and people are reading short bite-sized things. Sometimes you need the most extreme version of something just to get somebody to think a little more critically about it. Sometimes that backfires because people go into denial, like, well, we don't have a rape culture. Like, that's ridiculous. How can you describe it that way? At the same time, there are those backfires, but there might also be the incidents where someone who didn't think critically about it before started to engage. So it's a tricky balance. And I think for me, it's not so important the label, but recognizing and calling attention to and addressing the on the ground behaviors.
I had a question kind of following up between Jackson opening up our discussion with some terms and kind of unpacking them, as well as Maddie's description of culture and the importance of thinking about sort of community climate. And again, that can be within an organization, whether it's athletics or fraternity sorority, it could be institutionally, it could be, our broader community, state, federal, international. But I guess as you were doing that, I was really contemplating the degree to which there's consistency across different facets of our institution with regard to our understanding of some of these terms, consent, sexual harassment, and reporting mechanisms, and whether there's coherence. And I don't know. And I posed that to Jean and she wasn't sure either. So I'm hoping someone can speak a bit to that, because I think there is importance in terms of having institutional continuity with regard to policies. And obviously it's going to look a little different because students are a different group than, say, faculty or staff, but we are also one community. And I think that given the power and oppression lens, it's important to think about hierarchy and about consistency.
Yeah, good question, Tanya. Is there anyone who wants to speak to that question?
I'll try to speak to it, and anybody else who is on the working group or is currently still on the working group from this summer. One of the things that we've been working with our consultant on is the development of what they call one-pagers, in just the term they use, but some flow charts about reporting options, supportive measure options. They will have they're developing a one-pager for faculty and staff about their responsibilities for as sort of a responsible employee and someone who has to report. And so we've reviewed as the committee several of those, given feedback to the consultant. They're continuing to work on those. We should have some final copies of those next week to put our sort of final approval on, and then can get those up. We also will have some what they're calling sort of flyers that will be put in bathrooms, those sorts of things around campus. So I think we'll have some common educational and tools that we can use. And then I think you bring up a great point. We've got to do then more consistent education throughout that, and make sure that we understand those common terms, the definitions. I think in our new policy that we created will help, because there'll be common definitions that we'll use. So I think that's part of the focus of the working group moving forward. And I'd welcome anybody else that's worked on that this summer to chime in as well.
The policies that we've been working on, as Jeff said, are intended for everybody on this campus. But I guess the question I had, Jeff, and this is where I didn't know how to answer Tanya, is I know that there was a committee with a director of HR, and she was giving input on that too, because there's that aspect, that side of educating and informing the employees that I wasn't totally up to date on where we were going to go with that. And part of that may be that Lynn was out for a while, and so maybe we've just been the committee and she just hasn't been there. I don't know, but that was where I wasn't sure.
And that's a great question. The focus that our committee really has been working on is the student policies and the educational materials to not only educate students, but educate the rest of the community about what is in our student policies, what expectations there are for behavior through that area. I've not had any involvement on the HR side, although I know that there was a group meeting, but I have not been involved in that side of it. So I'm sorry, I can't speak to that.
And that really was my question, because again, I think as a campus community, whoops, is somebody else talking? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, you're good. We were trying to figure out our sound. For the staff side, they looked more like, and like employees of the college, they looked more retrospectively over the summer on the policies and like what was working and what wasn't working. And so I know that I know Jeff wasn't a part of that, but Susan Hopp was heading that up with Dawn Graffite and a couple other like employees from the school. And I don't exactly know where they ended up on that one because I've moved to the student side. But for more information, I think you should ask Susan Hopp about what they were doing on that aspect. And I do know that they just did the process navigator training for all of the employees that wanted to be a part of that. And I attended that and it was really good from Jackie. So yeah.
Yeah, Jackson and I think, attended that training as well and got our certificates. And I think it was good in that there was a lot of information and a lot of information about the process, a lot of information about how things work, a lot of information on, and you know, some tips about what to do if a student comes to you and things like that. I was involved in the spring in talking about our policies and procedures at Linfield. And so a lot of it was super familiar to me, but probably was less familiar to those who haven't spent a lot of time delving into that stuff. But I hear you, Tanya, and I feel similarly that we need everyone on the same page in terms of our expectations and our understanding of what is okay and not okay behavior, and not just for students, but for all of us, like for all of us and how we treat each other. And we all need to be aware, and maybe, you know, we could take what we learn about bystander intervention trainings and any sort of prevention trainings for students and broaden it, because a lot of what we've read about has looked at effectiveness of changing culture, of changing how people respond, to call it out more, like Jackson was saying. You know, would we call out these signs or these behaviors and these comments when we see them? And that needs to be consistent, and it needs to be applied evenly to everybody, regardless of who they are or where they are in the institution. And if we can get there, hopefully we can. Hopefully.
There's a question that came up anonymously in the chat that I wanted to share the question, but I don't have the answer to it, but maybe someone else in the room does. The question was, are there statistics out there that we, meaning Linfield, measure ourselves against in terms of looking at sexual assault prevalence and our response to it? So and I just don't know the answer to that. Is there a cohort of other schools that we compare ourselves against? Are there other comparisons? And I know there's a lot of other expertise in the room, so I just wanted to throw that question out there and see if we maybe have an answer to it.
Jackson, I can give sort of a non-answer answer. I know that if Patty was here, Patty Hadlin, I think she'd be able to help. We participated in the American Health Survey, and that's not the right name, but there's a national survey on health of college students that we participated, but it's been, I want to say, at least 8 years ago that we did that survey. And that had questions that were benchmarked on around sexual violence, sexual harassment, along with other health issues. It covers a variety of health issues. So that may be something that I'll bring that back to Patty and see in our cycle of sort of national benchmark assessment when might be a good time to revisit that survey. Because again, I know it's been, I think, at least 8 years since we've done that last on the survey, and it's just a matter of can we get that back in the mix of things. Jennifer Ballard, do you remember that?
I was not involved in that particular survey, so I don't know the details, but I did want to speak to, I'm not aware of anything we have currently, but we are planning to conduct a climate and climate survey in the spring via the HEADS consortium, which is a consortium of other small schools, and that includes some questions about sexual assault. So we're hoping to get good participation. We've got a group of people working together to try to deploy that. And one reason I'm here and to hear about what people are talking about, but also to let you all know that that will happen, and we'll be looking for that participation. That should give us some comparison of Linfield to some other schools that are a little bit like us. Is that kind?
I've been working closely with Patty, sorry, Beatrice, and speaking on the surveys, I think there was a problem with like over surveying. So our survey that we wanted was kind of, we were taking questions and inserting it into surveys that are already being done so that we could still get some sort of climate measurement about the campus. But I know that that's something that Patty is really pushing towards, is figuring out how we can implement the American College Health Assessment, I believe, survey to kind of get a better idea, because it has been a while, like Jeff said. In terms of measuring with other schools, I don't really know if there's a tool that we've been using to measure with other schools. I know that there have been other articles that are coming out in a lot of schools, especially like bigger schools or big schools a bit more on the East Coast, are barely starting to develop and implement some programming around sexual assault, sexual misconduct in trainings. And when I've been forwarded some of those articles, reading through it, it's like, oh, we're already doing that. We are implementing something like that, or we already have something similar. So I think that there's schools coming to us and asking, what are we doing and how can we help them set up their programs? I know Willamette and Reed are a couple of schools that we've consulted with, or at least I know the department has. I myself haven't, but I know that that's some of the work that we've been doing, and we're always working on seeing what else can we do, how can we support the good work that everyone's doing, because it can't be just a one person or one department, one team type of thing. It kind of takes everybody's support and help. So we appreciate everybody who's involved, and we're always looking to see how we can support. So there's not one thing that we measured, but I know that we've done a lot of work that other schools are barely starting to do. And so that makes us feel good, because we know that we've taken initiative and been working hard on this.
I've got a question I wanted to throw out to get a response from some of the coaches and other folks from athletics, maybe students we have here. There's no simple answer to it, but it just occurs to me that, you know, thankfully Linfield is not one of those schools where our women's teams are called like the Lady Wildcats or anything like that. But a lot of big schools like Baylor and others still do that, even in NCAA Division I. But the one question I had for all of you, and I think it's a unique challenge in some ways of athletics, is that this is one venue where we do very purposely have separate men's teams and separate women's teams. And I'm mindful of that every day when I come into my office, because we have some really old trophies for the debate team out in the hallway here in Ford. And there are some that say women's debate and men's debate. And we haven't had women's debate and men's debate categories for many years. I don't want to get into the broader category of, you know, broader discussion of collapsing, but it occurs to me that with this issue in particular, you know, kind of forced gender segregation on teams does create some unique challenges in athletics for discussing these issues and confronting these issues. And I wondered if any of you wanted to speak to some of those challenges or just had any general thoughts on that.
I think I could probably say a little bit about this. So in terms of, let's just say trophies and that kind of stuff, there is truly a women's championship in swimming, but likewise, there's a men's championship in swimming, but they're not conflated because they don't actually compete, you know, against each other, right? But when you go to our Hall of Fame, there is not a men's Hall of Fame and a women's Hall of Fame. There is a de facto overall Linfield University Athletics Hall of Fame. And so to that extent, I think that we're trying to do what we should be able to do. But if there's something else that I'm missing, I sure would like to know about it so that we could try to make some progress with it. So if anybody has anything they'd like to chime in with, be my guest.
I think it brings up interesting dynamics. Jackson, just thinking about your question, and having been an athlete, a college athlete, I was a swimmer, and men's and women's teams often worked out together, but we were separate teams. And so it just brings a different dynamic. As a female, I felt like there was a brotherhood with the men's swimmers that I did not feel with other male athletes on campus. Like I recognize there's always that allyship of like, oh, you're an athlete, I know you're an athlete kind of thing. But there was a brotherhood with the men's team, and so any violence that happened between men's and women's swimmers was like a heartbreak to the whole team, because and I know that might be probably another example of a team that deals with that kind of tightness would be track and field, cross country, where you're spending all your time together. And so a betrayal or any act of violence there is really like deep betrayal to the whole team. So I'd be curious to hear if our current athletes have any perspective on that sort of thing that they want to share. I think the other sports are so, I don't know what the partnership is like, let's say between softball and baseball. Do you feel like you're sister brother teams, or is it just two entirely separate teams that don't cross paths much? But I'd be curious to hear what our athletes have to say.
So I guess I was part of the football team, still am part of the track and field team. And like what Jane talked about, comparing it to the swimming, having like men's and women's, you're always practicing together. Comparatively between football and track and field definitely has that like camaraderie between both men and women. And you kind of have each other's backs, whereas in football seems to be, and I think I realized this more not being on the team, is it's like one of the one sports on campus that kind of like it's by itself. Whether it's like the lack of the players wanting to branch out or not having like a direct comparison, like men's or like soccer has like men's and women's soccer, softball and baseball. And it seems like football and volleyball are kind of those sports that doesn't have like a comparative like opposite gender sport. And I think that football could do a much better job of one, supporting other sports and athletes around campus and being able to, like, it's the biggest team on campus. And so I've been working with Coach Heyer and Jane and a lot of people within the student athletic advisory committee to kind of get football more involved and just get them, more involved in campus and see that they have a lot of power if used in the right way. And so I think that that's one thing that we're trying to focus on. So.
And Keaton, to add a little bit to what you just said too, football obviously is kind of in its own category, because you're right, it doesn't have a direct corollary. However, you have a lot of dual sport athletes that compete in football. You have a lot that do football track or football, baseball, etc. And the one team that I know interacts pretty often, I guess, with football is the softball team. At least I've seen that when they support each other because the seasons maybe, and maybe because Jackson coaches both. I'm not really sure, but I think that there is a little bit. But to the main point about football, it really just does not have anything that is even close to being the same size or anything like that. There's nothing that's similar enough to it. It already causes enough headaches for equity because of that, but that is something that's part of it.
Yeah, and I think that, like, honestly, one of the best things we've had in football, both at practice and just during the season in general, is our equipment managers are like 3 or 4 softball players,
right,
that are women. And as little as, like, obviously the ratio is like 4 women to whatever 150 guys out there, it does provide some sort of balance. And you can see kids on the team like checking what they say, and because they know that there's the opposite gender there. And so it doesn't completely get rid of a lot of the like hyper masculinity that you guys are talking about, but it does help a little bit to have them there. And a lot of us are good friends with them and respect them. And so if there's a way to like have more of that, I mean, I don't have any solutions, but that does help.
So Keaton, do you feel that same kind of connection with the student athletic trainers?
Yeah, that too. And that's
males, and right?
Yeah, and it definitely depends. Like, I know last year, I think there were maybe 4 or 5 women athletic trainers. So it was a lot more than we usually have. Usually it's like a mix of women and men, but that helped too. Yeah.
Yeah. So Maddie and Kristen, what is it like for soccer with men's and women's soccer? And it seems like lacrosse seems to be kind of in your family, for lack of a different way to say that. Is that true? Do you guys interact quite a bit, the men's and women's soccer programs, or?
I think like over the years, it's like our freshman year, I would say we were a lot closer with the men's team, but there is definitely that like partnership, no matter like how like personally close like our relationships are with them. We definitely do have a relationship with them, and it is kind of that same kind of camaraderie because we're traveling the same places, you know, all the time, or we have double headers with them and we're always supporting each other. So there is definitely that kind of like brotherhood, sisterhood kind of thing, even if like our personal relationships aren't like that close, but in years past, like they have been super close. So I would definitely say that that's a factor in how we treat each other.
Good.
You know, Jackson, I could share experience when I was in Hawaii, wrestling and judo in Hawaii. And I think about equity, because when I was in high school, women could participate in wrestling, but there would be exhibition matches against other women if they had other women to compete. And then I come to Oregon, I coach wrestling, and it was kind of the same way, but now they allow the girls to wrestle with guys. And then now in Hawaii, the women the girls wrestling have their own established state championship. So they're not competing with the guys. They have more women that are participating. And so a friend of mine in Lahaina, who's a Linfield graduate, Todd Hayase, he coaches both the boys and girls wrestling. And they've won state championships in the boys and the girls. So if it's empowered the women athletics, the teams, to have their own organization and ownership, and it's increased participation and other things to do. And what's sad is there's not very many women wrestling programs in the United States. But in Hawaii, they've created their own state championships and league championships, and they're competing like everyone else. So is that good or is that bad? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good, Doug. And I'm raising the broader question. I wasn't questioning that it was bad that we have men's and women's teams. I think particularly with this issue and the fact that almost every other club and organization and group on Linfield is mixed gender, but we've got single gender environments in athletics, that just creates literally a different playing field for you all and kind of addressing some of these issues and thinking about them. Yeah. So I'm not necessarily calling it out, and I wasn't trying to as a bad thing. I just think it creates unique challenges that you've got teams that are comprised of single sex environments, and particularly some of the hyper masculine behaviors in certain teams, I would imagine that's going to be a tougher cycle to break in a single sex environment like that, if I were trying to combat it.
No, I absolutely agree with that. And so the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, how do we make that changes? We know what the problems are. So we got to reach out to those problems. And if football and the males are the problem, then we got to get better at training and leadership in those programs.
And well, it's funny too, Jackson, I constantly go back and forth with sport because like I like to think that sport is a vehicle for social good, but then there's so many ways to poke holes in that. And the kind of the philosophical of like, why do we even have women in men's sports in the first place? Like, why do we even do that? And I think, but then I also thought of like, well, why do we have fraternity and sororities? Right? It's kind of the same, same thing, right? And so it's interesting. I think there is something to be gained from having the brotherhood or the sisterhood, but yeah, I do think that it also does create environments that do allow for gender oppression to really just kind of thrive, honestly. And it's really interesting. Tennessee was it's the Lady Vols. We were one of the schools that we hang on to that. And it's funny though, because when it was being debated a couple of years ago, people were not wanting to let that go because they had a stronger, some people are strictly Lady Vols fans and not any men's sports fans. And it was a really interesting, and I think it's super fascinating. And I think, and one of the things I do love here about Linfield is that we do have students are able to be multi-sport athletes, and they're able to do other activities too. So they're not just, hopefully not just, doing that one activity. But I definitely think the football culture thing is an issue at every school. I would say it's hard to find a school athletics that doesn't have that kind of, just because the nature of the hyper masculinity, like Keaton was saying, it's kind of cool. But yeah, I really love this discussion, and I think there's so much interesting things to think about.
I find myself kind of wondering, as a non-athlete, the quintessential, I think, stereotype of harassment that doesn't quite rise to the level of assault is locker room talk. And do men and women both participate in that? And is that perpetuating some of these issues?
I would say one thing that stuck with me from earlier, I think, I forget who was talking about it. It was either Yanna or Jackson. We're talking about how, like, when a racist remark comes up, we're pretty easy to, like, kind of tell that person, like, stop, like, that's not okay. But when, like, a sexist remark comes up, or, like, you play like a girl, like, that just kind of slides under the bus. And so I think that definitely in the locker room, talk like that goes on. And I think it can be easily stopped if people are willing to stand up to it. But there's not enough teammates or people that are willing to kind of tell their friends, hey, that's not okay to talk like that. And I don't know if it's because they think they, like, aren't being a good friend by saying that, whereas I think that really you're doing them a service by saying, hey, let's not talk like this. But I think that, yeah, it definitely goes on, and I think that there's an easy solution, but it's a lot easier said than done for some people to step up and stop people from talking like that. So.
Yeah, thanks, Keaton. And yeah, those conversations can be challenging. And I think unless you feel empowered to intervene in those moments, and if it's the culture of a team or the culture of a fraternity house or another environment where those things just aren't questioned, it's tough to be the leader who steps up and says, hey, that's not okay. We shouldn't be talking that way. It does require a bigger cultural shift. I think those big cultural shifts can start with one person, though, speaking up and starting to change the culture. It's just that it's a big risk for that first person, because they, of course, they're trying to be a good leader and address these issues, but they also run the risk of being ostracized from the group and getting a lot of pushback.
And on top of that, too, is being models of behavior. As I've coached football for over 30 years, not using that kind of language, and then supporting women's sports and other programs, as well as being a good father of a daughter who came to Linfield. It's just not one part or piece. I think it's built on multiple parts of support. The way you talk, the way you act, the way you interact with other people. I think all those things are important too. Yeah, it is tough in the locker room when the guys are talking about things, and someone's got to step up and not condone any of that kind of behavior. And you're right, Jackson, it's got to start with someone with strong leadership. Totally agree.
Yeah, but it is a big cultural shift. I mean, if we think broadly about gender oppression, even something like guys in the locker room making comments to each other like, are you going to get laid tonight? Like that sort of thing. Like those sorts of comments that are really challenging culturally to question, those need to be questioned, right? Because we need to recognize those for what they are. They're part of that broader cycle of gender oppression. And it's tough to break. It's tough to be out front on that.
Yeah, Jackson. So I totally agree with that. And coming into this role, all of these student athletes that are on here know how strongly I feel about all in. And this conversation is about being all in. It's about doing the right things for people around you and with you and so on. And I know how hard that is, Keaton. I know what you mean by that, to be in a locker room with a bunch of knotheads that are, you know, just blowing off their mouths. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's such a cool notion to think about the changes that we can bring about when we really do model that behavior of being all in and supporting each other about everything that we do. It's not just about the goddamn win-loss record. It isn't that to me at all. It's about us really buying into something that can be so powerful of an overall cultural shift that you walk away and you go, "Whoo, man, that is cool. That is how you're supposed to remember your collegiate experience." I don't want anybody to leave here having been sexually assaulted or, you know, something like that. That's we want to try to do everything that we can to position everybody around us to be as successful as they can possibly be as a human. And it really comes down to just that. So
a lot of times what is said, thank you, Gary. A lot of times what is said, often people are just repeating things that they've heard said. And so sometimes just interrupting that cycle is not as big of a deal as we may think it might be. Yeah, is Natalie still here? Natalie, you wanted to say something.
Yeah. Oh no, I was just really was just thinking too. I mean, I feel like there's an elephant in the room a little bit with what's gone on with Linfield this past year and issues. And I do want to make space for us to have a deeper conversation. I don't think we have time to get into it today, but one of the things I do love about this generation and you guys as college students is like the fact that you were able to create, I don't know if they're who actually created the Instagram, the sexual violence prevention, but like that, things like that like you're able to speak to one another in your own language and in a way that it can go a little bit probably further than any of us as administrators. But yeah, I just wanted to point out that like I think we all acknowledge that there's a cultural there are cultural issues I think that we all have to address. And just like social justice, this stuff is ongoing and it's something that we're thinking about all the time. And we're hoping to like, you know, just like I think that we've been a leader in the COVID space with how well we've done. It's like, you know, why can't we be a leader in all these other things too? But okay, I'm rambling, but yeah, just wanted to address that.
I wanted to ask Tanya, you posted a question in the chat about silencing. I wanted to understand more what you were asking.
I guess I was hearing Keaton talk about the self-silencing that can come at times where we don't want to be the person who, you know, brings the team down or challenges someone, but also the silencing that Nat was just talking about, of not making space for really difficult and challenging discussions. You know, rather just sort of sweep things under the rug and continue to pretend like we can just attend to one part of it. And that's going to fix the whole problem when in fact it's a culture that needs to be, you know, have light shown on it in a way that we can actually address it instead of pretend like it doesn't happen. That's what I mean by silencing. And with, you know, rape and assault, that is a huge factor that why people don't report as well, because people don't listen. And so why would you put yourself through, you know, the potential to be scrutinized if people are gonna blame you for something that happened to you?
I personally think like with this whole topic and like silencing and everything and like getting that conversation started, a lot of what I've been talking about with like the Title IX group has been that it really starts from the like education and the first day that we have students coming onto campus and how we like talk about Title IX and sexual assault. We go through and we make these like videos of like scenarios that are like honestly like super unrealistic and like are never gonna happen. And so students are like, oh, that doesn't matter. And it comes from like administrators and our coaches rather than from other students, like student-led like education and just conversations in small groups that like engage people and encourage them to like talk about these things and like really think about how they're acting are way more like productive than giving like some presentation or like having students watch some video and then answer a couple questions. Like it's just not effective at all because students just go through the motions. It's like any other thing that you do with class. Like, we know that Zoom classes aren't nearly as effective as in-person classes because students just sit and they don't pay attention. It's the same thing. So I think a lot of what we've been talking about, and like Jeff McKay and me have been talking about in the Title IX group, is how do we mandate across all groups? We have FSL that's doing one thing, we have athletics that's doing another thing, we have the I think it's like the CATS like program through the Health and Wellness Center doing something else. How can we, like, as a school and a community, give all the same information to everyone and have it be effective, that students are actually like engaging and interacting with it? And I think it starts from student groups like BET, like doing that kind of training with larger scale groups on campus rather than just FSL or just athletics. Like, it has to be every student to change the culture altogether.
Well said, Michaela.
Yeah, it's kind of a mic drop there. Good job.
Know your pain because we deal with the same thing with adults in our department.
I was gonna say,
A one-time deal is not gonna work.
Not just students.
Well, and the sexual harassment training that we did online that just came on board this year was ridiculous. It was exactly what you said, which is, you know, I mean, one of them was okay, but the other was pitched to K through 12 educators, and it didn't have any relevance to anything that I would see or do. I would say that's a waste of time, right? We need to think about how do we meaningfully engage in these difficult conversations that change intention, change thoughts, change the ways that we interact, the things that we will call out, what we look at in ourselves that we maybe shouldn't be doing or should be doing. And that comes from engagement, not just looking at a screen.
And I think, like, especially within the time of like COVID and everything that's going on, like, it's so easy to just say, let's just do it online. Like, it's really hard to like get in people in person and in groups that are safe. But I really honestly think that that risk and like taking those extra steps to make sure that we are doing it in small groups and still abiding by COVID guidelines is extremely important. And just doing something like online just because we have to do it is not going to be effective, and it's not going to change the culture on campus. And like what you were saying, like, Tanya, like, it doesn't matter like if you do it online or not. Like, you're really not getting the training because it's not being effective. Like, it's just as good as not doing it. So I mean, like, I know Hannah Waterman and Max Fonda, who are like working with the BET, have been like really pushing to like make sure that things are being done in person. And like, we're getting a video out right now, but that's the minimum that we can do. And I think that in the future, like, we have to just do more. Like, it's extremely important to like push through those barriers, even with the COVID and everything, to get people in person, and every single person, not just students, not just faculty, not just staff. It's everyone that has to be there and actually like engage and want to be there, not just because they're forced to. They have to be there to like engage with people.
Yeah, I will say thank you, Michaela and Tanya. I did talk with Jeff McKay about using the WildX platform in January to have further conversations about this, and to hopefully to get more students in the conversation too. So even though that's an online version, at least it's a free form dialogue, which I think is a pretty precious resource on campus, when anybody from any sector can jump on and have a say. So we are planning on that for January.
And it's kind of just, you know, we have to keep the dialogue going. We can't let it. I mean, this has been like the craziest year ever, but it was funny too when I think about a lot of comparisons with all the kind of news around COVID and college campuses, and like the debate over like, well, what is a college experience supposed to be? You know, and I think now we can really say like the pieces that we really value, but like, hey, you know, this ideal at this time in your life is one of the riskiest if you're a female, or if you're for this kind of behavior. It's like, well, you know, how do we really change that? And I've struggled with some of the, you know, kind of the thinking of like, well, you know, and I think it goes back to power and control too, of like who gets say and who gets, you know, I don't want to go on that tangent. I saw Reiner has a question.
Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, so I wanted to at the risk of seeming to beat a dead horse, I just wanted to come back to the point I made earlier about language, and with the discussion of training and really making training or creating something that people want to participate in and are going to engage in. Looking at the training that takes place in workforces, we've seen backlash against training, implicit bias training. And most recently, if you guys may have caught this in the news, that I think this was within the last month or so, the current presidential administration discontinued diversity training in federal agencies because of the language that was being used and then the content as well. But so people saw it initially on the surface. It seemed like, okay, this is just an act of a racist president, or he's biased. This is pure evidence that he's biased. But the explanation given was that it was really, they weren't comfortable with the sort of positioning America as having white supremacy and that sort of thing. And so I think that if you really want, you really have to be mindful of the language and what people might read into, the language, if we were talking about, again, with this notion of things like rape culture, and not to, and I completely understand, appreciate your perspective shared, Jackson. I don't know if he's still on the call or not, but yeah, I just wanted to underscore that that is really something that it happens in workplaces where we have backlash because of how the training is positioned, and people don't want to be put on a guilt trip. And so anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
No, that's a great point. Really great point, Reiner. And it's kind of like, how do we just overall get away from this mindset of like a one-time training or a one-off thing? And I love what Michaela was saying too, of like, for students, it really is a student-to-student, peer-to-peer contact. And the thing is too, that, you guys, most likely will cycle through in 4 or 5 years, and we have a whole new, it's a whole new batch of students that come through, but we do have, hopefully a little more consistency on the admin staff, faculty side. So thinking about that dynamic too, I think is really, really great. And Jackson, I wanted to hand it back over to you. I didn't mean to take over with the.
Oh, no, not at all, Natalie. Thank you. And I do have a 1:30 appointment with an advisee coming up, so I've got to head out soon. I did want to say one more thing before I leave the meeting, and that is just to echo something I said at the beginning. Thank you all for participating in today's discussion. This is not an easy topic to discuss. And Tanya said this, mentioned it briefly before she had to leave the meeting. Sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes. So I just, whenever I have these kind of conversations with audiences, I always want to invite you to reflect on that and reflect on the fact that I know it took a lot of courage just for some of you to make some comments about this topic today. It helps you to understand and maybe imagine why it's so difficult for someone who has been assaulted to come forward. If we can't talk about it or have reluctances around talking about it, even in a group like this, imagine what someone who's even on, like we had the good example, Jane, I think you gave it, of the community you felt between the men's and women's swimming teams. Well, there's a lot of pressure on someone who's assaulted then by someone else in one of those groups to maybe not want to upset the balance of camaraderie that's within that group. So I just think it's important to acknowledge the various pressures that are on survivors, whether it's not wanting to create discord in their community or just general reluctance around talking about these issues that we all might experience in a discussion like this. I think that's important to acknowledge and keep in mind. But thanks again, everyone, for participation, and really appreciated the questions.
Thank you so much, Jackson, and Yanna too, who's already gone. And Maddie, thanks for being here and sharing your perspective on the research too. And all of our students who were able to participate today, thank you for everything you contribute to our community and to these conversations every week. It's just so valuable. Thank you. Thanks for everything you do on campus too.
Yeah, and just want to echo too that we want this space to be for you guys. We don't want to have to feel like we're force feeding. So if you guys want to, I know we're getting into the kind of the holidays and the breaks, but for in the spring, feel free to come to us with ideas of things you want to do with this space, because we're more than open to give you the platform.
Yep, it's here every Friday, no matter what. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jackson.
Yeah,
thank you
all.
Have a
Thank
great
you,
week.
Jackson.
Keep
Thank you, everybody.
There.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Rats.
Bye. Keep well.